Hello and welcome to Views on News. I am Jawad Tehami. Now, Indian authorities are carrying out a massive manhunt for a Sikh separatist leader, Amritpal Singh. Now, the IG of the Punjab state in India says that around 150 supporters of Amritpal Singh have been arrested. The reports of internet shutdown also in Punjab that has affected over 20 million people. Now, Amritpal Singh is vocal about the demand of the Sikhs for a separate homeland from India that is known as Khalistan. Now, this Khalistan movement has gained force in the recent past as referendums were held in the major capitals in around the world, and we have also seen Indian government protesting against these referendums to all those governments where these referendums were held. Now, when we talk about the response by certain governments of these countries, specifically talking about Canada, which has categorically said it is the right to freedom of expression. Now, we'll be talking about why Indian authorities are so afraid of Amritpal Singh, as well as why they have protested before the foreign governments where the referendums were held and how those governments have responded. We have seen other major developments happening in Modi's India. In a major development before the weekend, top opposition leader from the Congress, Rahul Gandhi, was disqualified from the parliament, after which we saw a ruckus in the parliament on Monday, and it was adjourned twice. We have also seen that there are 7 eastern states in India that have set up their camps and banners in Geneva on the 52nd meeting of the United Nations Human Rights Council, calling for their liberation from India. There is another major development. We have seen Indian authorities coming up with the reason of technical glitch when they misfired 3 missiles in Rajasthan state. We have heard about this technical glitch mantra before also when Indian authorities misfired BrahMos in Pakistan. Now, that raises some serious questions about the safety mechanisms of missiles in India and its ability to handle such arsenal. Let me bring in our panelists. We are honored to have been joined in this studio by Air Vice Marshal retired Ijaz Malik, senior analyst. Mr. Malik, thank you very much for your time, for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. And we are also honored to have been joined in the studio by Mr. Hannan Hussain. He is expert foreign affairs. Mr. Hannan, thank you very much for your time, also for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. Let me begin the discussion with you, Mr. Malik, talking about, we are joined by another participant. We are honored to have been joined all the way from the UK. If you allow me to just go to him first on the phone line, by Mr. Ranjit Singh Srai. He is a lawyer and the member of the World Sikh Parliament. Mr. Ranjit Singh Srai, thank you very much for your time, for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. Now, we have seen in the recent past the Khalistan movement gaining attraction all around the world. Now, specifically when we talk about this massive hunt that is being carried out by the Indian authorities for Amritpal Singh, what makes the Indian authorities so much afraid of Mr. Amritpal Singh?
Thank you for having me. The principal reason for the crackdown on Amritpal Singh and his supporters is it's a similar story to what we've seen elsewhere in Punjab over the years and what we've seen in Kashmir. The essential question here is whether the Indian state, especially in the form of a Hindutva inspired regime under Narendra Modi, is whether the Indian state has the ability, has the capacity to understand that international law provides for the right of self-determination. And the Indian state should be bound by international law. The reality is that India refuses to accept that requirement of international law. Self-determination is a fundamental human right. It applies to the Kashmiris, it applies to the Sikh nation as well, in our respective homeland. And the truth of the matter is that India has lost the argument in relation to Sikh self-determination. It has lost the argument in relation to Kashmiri self-determination. And because of that, it is resorting to military oppressions, use of draconian criminal law to suppress these movements and to curtail fundamental freedoms such as the right to freedom of expression. And this has led to a crackdown over the last week on Amritpal Singh and his supporters, and other pro-Khalistan activists, lawyers, journalists, leaders of all descriptions across Punjab have been targeted in a bid to silence the growing acceptance in Punjab that Azadi, independence, is the only solution for the Sikhs.
Right, Mr. Srai, when we talk about the response by the major world powers, especially in the West, when we specifically talk about Canada, it categorically says that referendums which were held over there are the right of freedom of expression. Now, we have also seen that India has also summoned the Canadian top diplomat about the protests which were held by the demonstrators of the Khalistan movement over there before the Indian High Commission in Vancouver also. Now, do you also expect similar sort of response from the other major world powers also, including the US, the UK and others as well?
The response that we expect is essentially what we've seen. In the UK, the Punjab referendum, the Punjab independence referendum, was carried off very successfully. Tens of thousands of Sikhs took part. Similarly, we've seen that in Canada, we're seeing it now in Australia, in other parts of the world as well, including Europe. And so Western democracies understand that the right of freedom of expression is inalienable. If you are peacefully expressing your political opinion, your political views, you're campaigning peacefully, then democracies respect that as a legitimate activity and do not close it down. Now, India has been waging a war of words against some of the governments across the world for allowing this peaceful democratic exercise to take place. And I would say that India is simply exposing itself when it does this. It's simply exposing itself as the enemy of democratic politics. And again, this takes us back into the use of force, the criminalization of legitimate political activity that we see in India itself.
So when we talk about the international law, there are certain provisions in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights about the right to self-determination, in the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights also. So when you see such a response coming from the Canadian government especially, do you expect any sort of intervention by the United Nations itself and its Security Council into this particular matter for the Sikhs demanding their right to self-determination as per the UN Charter?
One would hope so, but we've seen in the case of Kashmir that even when the Security Council passed a resolution, or several resolutions, favouring a plebiscite, then it's difficult to bring that about when you have an intransigent military power that's preventing that kind of exercise on the ground. So over time, we do expect to build international public support for the right of self-determination for the Sikhs in Punjab, just like we've seen in Kashmir. But I will say, you mentioned international law. I would like to emphasize one point. You are absolutely right. The 1966 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, in Article 1, sets out the right to self-determination. It's very, very important for everybody, your listeners, for the international community generally, to note that when India signed up to the 1966 Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, it, at the same time, incredibly, I would say, at the same time, it entered a reservation against the 1966 Covenant, saying that it does not recognize that the right of self-determination should apply to the nations that are held captive within its territory or within its borders. Now, that is a completely illegal position. It's an unlawful position. The United Nations itself has pointed this out to India and asked it to withdraw that reservation. And to this day, India has refused to withdraw that reservation. I might just add that several countries also made a very public stand on this. Holland, France, Germany all entered formal comments at the United Nations objecting to the Indian reservation against Article 1, and so indeed did Pakistan.
Right. Mr. Srai, when we talk about this particular Khalistan movement, we saw a couple of developments in the last couple of weeks also, especially the replacement of Indian national flag with the Khalistan movement flag at the Indian High Commission in London. And now the Indian authorities, they protested with the authorities in London also about this. And there were some assurances by the British authorities to Indian authorities regarding this particular act. How do you see, there was a tit for tat gesture also by the Indian authorities regarding that. They also removed the temporary security barricades that were placed in front of the British High Commission in India. How do you see that? And what about that removal and the replacement of Indian national flag with the Khalistan movement flag?
These are peripheral, very, very peripheral incidents, which the Indian media and the Indian government have taken to a frenzied level. It was so petulant when they removed the security around the British High Commission in New Delhi that, frankly, it became laughable as a step. And the international community will look upon that as proof to see that India has become the Hindutva frenzy that's taken over the Indian establishment has now lost all sense of proportion. I would also say, though, that if the Indian government and the Indian media were able to make such a racket and make such a noise about the breaches of human rights carried out by the Indian state over the years, such as the massacre in Punjab in 1984 and then elsewhere in India in 1984, and also the Gujarat massacre, if the state and the media in India were able to pay half as much attention to genocide, to mass systematic state terrorism in its own country, then the world would be a better place.
Right. Mr. Srai, when we talk about the discrimination which is being meted out to various groups there in India, especially when we talk about Muslims, as well as you also mentioned the Gujarat massacre and also the massacre of Sikhs over there, we talk about the discrimination being meted out to Christians and Dalits also. Now, when we talk about the major concerns of the Sikh community, are these concerns with the Hindutva-driven ideology of this BJP inspired by RSS, or do you have similar sort of concerns with the Congress party as well?
Let's be very clear about this. Congress party under Indira Gandhi was operating a Hindutva philosophy as well. It was appealing to the majority community. This majoritarianism is present in the Congress as well as in the BJP. This is the communal divide that is running Indian politics for decades. And it saddens me to say this, but minority nations, Sikhs, Kashmiris, and other minorities within Indian-controlled territory, they are going to face an onslaught until and unless India is brought to book. And by saying that, I mean brought to account in terms of international law. And minorities have their rights. National minorities have rights, such as the right of self-determination. Everybody has basic human rights, such as we've seen the genocide that's taken place, the use of incarceration, political prisoners. We have Sikh political prisoners who have been in Indian jails for over 25 years. These rights are all ignored by the Indian media, and yet they can make a hullabaloo about an incident here and an incident there. These grave human rights abuses are ignored, and it's this communal divide that allows the Indian state, its government, its establishment, its media to operate on this basis, and it's international law that will need to hold these people to account.
Right. Thank you very much for your time, Mr. Ranjit Singh Srai, lawyer and member of the World Sikh Parliament, joining us from the UK on the phone line. We really appreciate that. Now, Mr. Malik, now what sort of an action do you think the international community, especially when we talk about the United Nations and other major world powers, to take against India? Should these be punitive measures in form of sanctions wherever and whenever, by whoever these human rights violations are taking place within India?
Obviously, as a logical consequence to these recent developments which you have covered and our fellow panelist from UK has referred to, logically there should be a response, but that would be, in my humble opinion, it will be emanating mostly from the human rights activist groups. I don't think so under the prevalent regional global politics which are focused towards containment of China and Russia and giving support to India. I think it will be ignored by United States, and obviously then we don't expect much from United Nations, and it would have same fate as the issue of Kashmir, which is very volatile and active for past 3 years after its status was revoked.
So Mr. Hannan, what's your take regarding this? How do you see this particular movement, the Khalistan movement, heading forward? Is it gaining more force and traction with every single passing day? And what makes the Indian authorities so much afraid of Mr. Amritpal Singh?
Yes, thanks, Jawad. So I think, first of all, when you look at the movement, the cause has been there for decades. It was just revived based on a figure that was able to put out Punjab's concerns really quickly. And that's what has irked the BJP government. So I think more figures that kind of play into Amritpal Singh's very legitimate narrative about self-determination could add more fuel to it. And what better time than now when the Indian authorities are kind of caught on the defensive foot. In terms of going forward, I think there are options. So for example, even when you talk about human rights and self-determination, I think a test for this particular movement is going to be how it joins other human rights concerns in the conversations emanating out of, for example, European capitals as well. We do see that the Khalistan support, for example, a starting point, in my view, would be to get key European capitals on board and have some sort of, I'd say, formal sponsorship or an expression of intent for the freedom of liberation or the independence or the freedom of speech coming for Khalistan from these capitals. What that does is it defeats the Indian expectation that states, when coerced by India diplomatically, would be able to represent favorable silence on the matter. When you have more states kind of buying into the freedom of expression narrative, and we do see that from Canada, we've seen signs from Australia as well, where they've said, look, we've got great diplomatic ties with India, true, but what is happening cannot be a cause for ban in our eyes. So I think starting off with key capitals, getting sort of buy-in for the Khalistan narrative and kind of building momentum is something that's going to lend visibility to this very legitimate cause. And I think the Indian government is pursuing a shutdown narrative. It believes that it's going to proceed with that front, but as we've seen with the manhunt, it's simply not working. So,
Mr. Malik, now we have seen in other developments, 7 eastern states of India set up their camp and banners in Geneva on the 52nd meeting of the United Nations Human Rights Council. Punjab didn't happen to be one of those states. Now, they are vying for that Khalistan movement, a separate homeland from India. Don't you think they should have actually ideally joined hands with those states, and that would have given more force to their case?
Actually, I think we need to understand the history and the dynamics of these. There is a group of states which you have referred to. It has been there for decades. But the other group which represent the occupied Kashmir and Punjab, it had different conditions. They have certain similarities. The atrocities which have been happening before revoking the status of Indian occupied Kashmir and after that, and what has happened in 1984 in Operation Blue Star in Punjab, the crackdown on Golden Temple, and the massive people were killed and the massive atrocities. So these two states probably they identify themselves differently as compared to the rest of the states which are in the red corridors. Just a remarks, with reference to your previous question to our panelists. This has been the history of Indian governance. Even in the Congress times, 2 of the sitting prime ministers were assassinated because of these similar atrocities and the reaction of people against them. So Congress was no different in ideology as far as the communal outlook was concerned, but their operational tactics were different. But after this RSS Hindutva regime has taken a legal status in India, it has come upfront and openly, and they having good control or access in international media, they build a narrative, they crack down such movements, such activities with a strong armed tactics, and then they expect that people will buy their idea. But I think in today's world, with this very vibrant social media and the young generations in Kashmir as well as in the Sikh communities, it is very difficult to handle them, and it will continue to build up. There will be a snowball effect in the future as far as these 2 movements are concerned.
So, Mr. Hannan, your take regarding if all these states join hands together and go for a collective effort for the right to self-determination and the separation from India, don't you think the case would be even more forceful at the international level?
Ideally, it would be, but I think if you look at how India has been approaching these states, there are certain limitations within the movement which India is, presenting as a cause to kind of keep states away from exactly what you pointed out. First of which is that there's outstanding support for the Khalistan movement abroad. I believe that there's strong support internally as well, because the narrative is mobilized internally in Punjab. And I think when we saw key events such as the farmers' protest being taken over by this particular, I'd say year-long exercise by Amritpal Singh, that kind of gave, injected new impetus into the understanding that, look, the Khalistan cause can be generated, it's going to be a long fight, but we're going to proceed with it. I think it is the Indian actions that is making this less acceptable to the international community. Again, this movement has a lot of growth that needs to be reached, but when you look at the behavior coming out from key, I'd say, India's strategic partners as well, you see Canada, Australia, you see in EU capitals as well. The idea is to present this as a narrative and say, look, we have these sort of developments taking place. We saw it during the 80s as well when India did kind of proceed with a military operation. But there's no legitimate, I'd say, effort to kind of take the Sikhs on board and then address those grievances head on. I think the time has passed for that. The Sikhs are basically focused on the tactics India is employing. And I think the more India tries to stifle it, the more there's going to be an effect to kind of bring these out into the open. The Khalistan movement will benefit to a certain degree because many of these protests and these approaches to kind of stifling dissent are not exclusive to the movement. We've seen it with Kashmir, we've seen it with internally as well, opposition to Modi, right? But I think the more the events are kind of kept under the carpet, social media comes forward, you have these reports coming out, there's a lot of activism in these capitals to document these things and bring it in front of the consular as well. I think that is in turn going to challenge the narrative that, look, there's been a lot of stability and there's nothing to report. So I think India, based on this current narrative, is very sensitive to that sort of optics internationally, because it has a narrative to build and say, look, this is the largest democracy in the world, nothing can go wrong. But I think the Khalistan movement at this point would kind of try to challenge that. I think even if Amritpal Singh is arrested, I think it kind of validates a lot of the fears within Punjab that, look, this decades-long fight was not in vain. There was a lot of leadership involved with it, but we need somebody to succeed with this momentum, because if it dies out, then I think it's going to make things much more easier for India to tell its partners and say, look, just look the other way. We're going to revisit this at a later time.
Do you see similar sort of a force within India of this movement also, or only abroad it is more forceful as compared to within India?
Within abroad it is more focused and it's more forceful because, look, for several reasons. First of all, you have the liberty to kind of bring forward referendums. There's no sort of state approach to kind of stifle that process, frustrated, a clampdown with the Hindu nationalist edge to make sure that they comply. Secondly, I think the laws over there are more liberating. So in the sense that India has been able to use a lot of punitive measures, many of which were pointed out by the previous speaker as well, that they want to use it's all part of the same system, the military, and then of course how the government approaches these legal loopholes to make sure that we can declare anybody as terrorist, and there's going to be no sort of a probe into it. The West isn't buying that narrative. They're of course unfortunately, they're very careful about their sensitivities towards India for other reasons, economically and politically. But I think human rights in itself, when you do see that kind of narrative coming forward, international activism, that can make for a pretty good ground to make sure that we keep giving this momentum, because if it dies out, it's going to be a bad look for many of the values many of these countries stand by.
So when we talk about the popularity of this movement within India, there is a statement by the spokesperson of the Chief Minister of Punjab. Now, he says that Singh's popularity in specific is a social media problem. So how do you analyze this particular statement?
I think to a certain degree it's right, because there are times when the same narrative, the same evidence can gain a lot of traction. There are times when it kind of dies down. I think from the Khalistan movement point of view, we've seen that on ground the presence is strong, I mean in terms of how they resonate with the communities, but there needs to be a conscious effort to mobilize social media in a way that kind of keeps pressing and bringing these, less reported aspects up to the front. I think the major challenge for the Khalistan movement, and I'd say a major point of insult for the Indian media, is that the Khalistan movement overnight cannot assume the strengths of an entire media apparatus and say, look, this is what we report, this is how we go, because that will assume a huge level of mobilization with its international partners. They've done well to make sure that they bring out demonstrations, because that's been kind of like a mainstay in their relations. But I think in terms of the movement to evolve, social media needs to be given a whole lot of traction so that many of the narratives that are delivered in person are also translated there. One of the merits over there is that social media has a longer lifeline with regard to visibility with the Indian atrocities and the way they're kind of going about this narrative. That could really benefit the movement.
Right. Mr. Malik, if I heard you right previously in your take, you were mentioning that the ideology, if we gauge that Congress and the Bharatiya Janata Party happen to be of the same grade or state, when we talk about their operational procedures, the difference comes over there. So if ideologically, if we assume both of them have the same understanding and they only differ in their procedural methods towards dealing with different communities. So what makes Mr. Rahul Gandhi, as we earlier saw him giving remarks in Britain, that Indian democracy is under attack?
Mr. Rahul Gandhi now represents, as a Congress leader, he represents the voice of relatively saner component of Indian society, which are still trying to maintain the legacy of India being largest democracy. So that is where there are common grounds for Mr. Rahul Gandhi to indirectly support whether it is a minority group or a communal incidents in which they are taking the narratives and the actions of RSS ideology led by BJP government head on. But definitely the space for minorities has been shrinking over the years. In the past 75 years, gradually, and Congress has been responsible. What has happened in Kashmir today or since last 3 years, it is because of the steps which were taken by Congress supported regimes in Indian occupied Kashmir. It was the commitment of the Congress Prime Minister then, Mr. Nehru, which they did not comply, and they, every time they would, try to just put it under the carpet, under the garb of a installed puppet governments there, replacing the approved United Nations agreed mechanism of plebiscite of right of self-determination by just showing that there is a certain number of people who have voted for this legislators to form the parliament there in the state, and it's the replacement and it reflects the will of the people, and so it's legal to govern them.
So, but we have seen a recent criticism, categorical criticism by the BJP leadership, especially by Home Minister Mr. Amit Shah, about the policy of Mr. Nehru going to the United Nations for this Kashmir case.
Yes, actually, I am not surprised with Mr. Amit Shah's comments, because this is just that he is giving the comments. Otherwise, in essence, they have shattered that dream of India. Indian Constitution, Article 1 defines India as a union of states who are willing to stay within India. And it's not holding states hostage to make this constitution or form of the government to be functional. So they have actually shattered the dream of united India for different states.
Right, Mr. Malik, how do you see this disqualification of Mr. Rahul Gandhi from the parliament over a remark, over a conviction for a remark during the 2019 election campaign?
I think it is a very immature thing on the part of the ruling party. Just if they compare themselves with democracies like United States, just see what happens there. The sitting president, there are demonstrations against him, and there are remarks, and the effigies are being burned right there in Washington DC, and nobody ever takes notice of that. It dies down within 24 hours, which is the life of a news cycle.
But also the question of defamation also. Calling a certain specific surname and branding it certain specific thing which is very uncalled for as per the thing which has been said by the Indian authorities also.
Yes, but the punishment which is being given, it looks like on prima facie, it looks like a political victimization, an excuse to just corner him.
Right, Mr. Hannan, what do you think about this particular disqualification of Mr. Rahul Gandhi?
I think, first of all, it's going to be very difficult to establish it as a legal argument. I think it comes across as political because I think the timing is something that's of huge concern. I mean, this is not just any other protester, any other dissenter against the government. It's the member of a leading opposition party. I think, but at the same time, I think the BJP is not interested in legal arguments. It believes it can afford not to listen. It can get leaders behind bars. Of course, the defamation process is something that's going to be executed in a way that's going to be consistent with what India calls to be laws that are interpreted right in its favor. But I think defamation allows enough selectivity to the BJP government to say, look, we know what the temperature is. The Hindu nationalist wave is not going to be dented by Rahul Gandhi being put behind bars. And I think India on its front has enough of a precedent to withstand international pressure to go forward with that. The two areas where I think this is going to be very, very unsustainable is, first of all, India's narrative that rights violations can be set aside and we can move forward is something that's giving a larger threat landscape greater traction, because the more that the countries afford to look away, it starts off with Kashmir, goes towards the Sikhs, now moves towards the opposition leaders. We've seen many protesters being put behind bars. Journalism in India is no surprise. So I think it's really raising the costs of looking away from India. And I think that's something that has been noted as a concern within the US and elsewhere as well. You might not see it from the Biden administration per se, but independent watchdogs that are involved, Congress is informed of all of this as well. So I think to that end, it's a bit of an irritant. It makes it difficult to look away. And I think secondly, from the Indian part, I think you're looking to lock out a key political party out of the equation. We don't see them competing against the BJP, true, but I think India's slide towards dictatorship and authoritarianism is again validated by targeting a political leader, making sure that he's put behind bars, and all when the target has been Modi. Similar to how we saw the BBC kind of approached Modi, kind of blow the whistle on what the Supreme Court justified in our previous show as well, and then of course that kind of rattled the wrong nerves. So I think when you talk about a key leader, Rahul Gandhi, the position and the party that he represents in the legacy is going to be difficult to sustain, because to many it may seem as if the BJP trying to kind of belt out more of the competition, kind of keep it away and make sure that there's only one party, one man that the country listens to. That's not a narrative that's going to settle democratic for long, should this go forward. So
what are going to be the implications in the longer run for overall Indian society and its politics? So
for society, I think the BJP is unfortunately pretty well positioned to make sure that dissent and protest is kind of put to the side, is well accustomed. So I don't see like a huge uprising that takes down Modi, because his interests with the population are grounded in other streams, for example, economic as well. I think internationally, there's going to be a lot of silent whispering in India's ears to say, look, this is making it really difficult for us to kind of paint or justify your actions as such. And I think when you talk about Rahul Gandhi being put behind bars, that kind of activates international activism on human rights as well. I mean, personally, I'm no fan of Rahul Gandhi, because when you look at how key issues that we talked about, the minority rights and everything, give Congress power to look towards the vote bank is not exactly moved by support for Sikhs, it's not moved by support for Kashmiri, so that's going to be a different argument. But when you talk about disrupting the level field politically, I think internationally there's going to be a lot of whispering in India's ears to say, look, you're proceeding in this direction, it's very difficult for us to kind of sustain this image, and I think India, to certain degrees, will face pressures, so it's going to raise the stakes. Is it going to lead to a reversal? I don't think so, but when this legal argument goes forward, look very closely for loopholes through which the BJP justifies the narrative, because Rahul Gandhi being put behind bars and Congress being forgotten is something that's still a very distant thought right now.
So, Mr. Malik, your take regarding, is there any going to be any sort of an impact on the election position of BJP in particular after this particular move by them of disqualifying Rahul Gandhi?
Not much. I would agree with my fellow panelists that unfortunately, as of now, the BJP party, they have definitely convinced or coerced, whatever you say, but they still have control over majority of the vote bank, and they can associate themselves. That's why they are being so reckless in handling their domestic affairs. If they were worried about their vote bank, probably their approach would have been much saner than what they are doing right now.
Right. So one very important development, we saw that 3 missiles were misfired in Rajasthan state a couple of days back, and it has been again associated with the technical glitch by the authorities. So this is a mantra not new, new for us. We are hearing it for another time. We heard it during that particular misfire of a BrahMos in Pakistani territory. So that, don't you think that raises serious questions about the safety of the missile system and India's ability to handle and control it?
Exactly. We have been raising voice, and internationally there have been some concern being shown about the command and control system of Indian assets. And I think Pakistan must mobilize its diplomatic resources and other forums which are appropriate to raise voice about the command and control system.
So what ideally happens to be the responsibility of the international forum, the concerned associations or the quarters when such type of technical glitches start happening so often?
First of all, it should affect the status, from the non-supplier groups, for example, and the other forums which are supporting the development of or assisting them in technological advancement of their nuclear program. So those are the channels which have the legal or moral obligations to ask India to put those measures in place which make sure that their command and control system is well organized and it's well under control, and such instances happening so frequently, there should be curtailed.
So if it doesn't stop over here, we saw that falling into Pakistan's territory first, and then now they exploded within India. It could be somewhere else the third time and the fourth and the fifth. So if continues to happen, what ideally should be done?
Actually, it would depend on the last incidents in which a missile, came, it was launched and it was tracked by, detected and then tracked by Pakistan Air Defense. Pakistan reacted very, maturely, I would say, as a state and as a custodian of the airspace, the Air Force itself. But it depends on the then prevalent political environment, because if the political temperatures are high and you see a missile heading into your territory and exploding here, then the reaction will generate, because those things even if they are defined, these are not disclosed during peacetime. So this has a direct proportion to the then prevalent political environment, temperature. So I think we just pray that better sense prevails and they live up to the expectation of the saner world as regard the handling of the nuclear and strategic assets.
Right. Mr. Hannan, how do you see this particular technical glitch mantra by the Indian authorities? And if such type of technical glitches keep on happening, what ideally should be done? What happens to the responsibility of the international community and especially the concerned quarters?
I think for the concerned quarters, the responsibility is pretty simple. See a pattern which countries like Pakistan have seen. I think if Pakistan, for example, was to register protests in the future about its neighboring country kind of moving around with these kind of arsenals and then with these kind of arms and weaponry and then not having the competence to kind of operate them, I think that would make for that pattern to be visible to other countries. I think as far as this particular narrative goes, look, there's going to be, from the international community, one of the limitations that I'm going to see is that it's more of a bilateral concern, right? It comes off once in a while. I think India was able to kind of skirt accountability by sacking, I think, 3 of their officers last time it happened on Pakistan soil. But I think the Indians are very capable of forming a pattern of incompetence when it comes to operating on these things. I think whether it's the bureaucracy or how you're going about it, it's clear that these very dangerous weaponry being put in India's hands is not necessarily leading to a very safe signal regionally. So I'd be on the lookout for more of these exercises happening. This, of course, was part of an exercise that was happening. And I think when more of these things pile up, Pakistan, for example, would have to take the lead because I don't think Afghanistan is going to be in a position to do so. And I think it's always easier because the world right now, from disarmament to nuclear non-proliferation, is all about kind of limiting risk. And when a neighbor is hell-bent on doing that, it makes for incentive to kind of look towards it a bit more strictly with a greater degree of scrutiny. Yeah. Mr.
Hannan, Hussain, expert foreign affairs, thank you very much for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. And Air Vice Marshal retired Ijaz Malik, senior analyst, thank you very much for your time also, Mr. Malik. Really appreciate that. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Till the next one, take good care of yourselves.